Hi, I'm Alison Donnelly, Payments Regulation Specialist, Director of FSCon, the boutique compliance consultancy, and I also have the privilege of being the Ambassador in Ireland for the European Women in Payments Network. In this EWPN networking session, Siobhan Coburn interviews Sara Savage. Siobhan is the Programme Manager at the Merchant Risk Council. She's a great supporter of the EWPN and is passionate about diversity and inclusion. And she also happens to be one of the nicest people you could meet. Equally so is Sara Savage. Sara is the Managing Director of JP Morgan's Wholesale Payments, and she is passionate about payments and people. This really comes across in the next session. We were all very inspired, especially as one of the key takeaways was to know your own worth and value and to make sure that people around you do so as well. This session was filmed, but after the camera switched off, we had time to discuss amongst ourselves and even to put more questions directly to Sara. If you'd like to know anything more about the European Women in Payments Network and to join any of our next sessions, please do get in touch. I hope you enjoy this session. Thank you.
But could you tell us what it was like when you first embarked on your career in the payments industry?
Crikey, it was a long time ago, Siobhan. I started my career straight from school. As a spirited second child, I resisted my parents' advice to go to college, and I was lucky enough to be offered a role with Barclays. My payments career started around sort of 7 or 8 years later, in the mid-90s, when every morning I would get up and in the boot of my car, I would have probably around 30 PDQ devices. And the little zip zaps. I'm not sure how many of you remember the zip zap machines, right? But they were the backup in those days. And I would cover the local patch here in London, actually, although it looked very different back then. And the landscape was very different. So I guess ecom was just starting, and certain high growth and high risk sectors like online gaming and travel were just starting to use and leverage various different web-based platforms. I think perhaps maybe on a more of a personal note, I was one of a handful of women in the Barclays Merchant Services team. We had a team of over 100 people and merchant services representatives up and down the country. And I was one of 3 women at one point in the team. So I guess the landscape was very, very different. And when I think back, even into more recent times, women in payments were unusual. Women in payments in sales were even more unusual. And for me, when I used to look up to the people that would inspire, or perhaps maybe I would aspire to be like in the future, there was no women at the leadership table. So it was very, very different than what it is now. I think the world has moved on quite significantly, but still lots of work to be done.
Brilliant. And it just goes to show, like, now when you do look around, there's not enough, but at least there are a few familiar people to look out for. Like many others that are with us today, myself included, you also made a really big leap during the pandemic by not only changing roles, but changing organisations as well. And what were some of the highs and lows of doing this?
Yeah, so from 1988 to January 2020, I'd had 3 employers, Barclays, RBS, and then most recently First Data. And I had 2 employers in 2020. So it was kind of crazy, really. Who in their right mind changes roles during COVID? I did it twice. And I think in terms of the highs were as I get to now lead the international expansion agenda for JP Morgan, right? Which back when I was selling PDQs from the boot of my car, I didn't dream in 100 years that I would ever be in this particular role. So I guess that's the high. But in terms of some of the challenges, right, if you haven't met your teams, or perhaps maybe you've been onboarded virtually, it's difficult sometimes to find your rhythm, right? You need to bond, you need to try to build that dynamic with the teams that you're working with. I still haven't met my boss. She's in the States, and for some reason they won't let me in at this point in time, although they tell me it's not personal. So I look at that in terms of the highs, maybe not so much the lows, but just the challenges that in a normal non-COVID world we wouldn't have. And I think I'm a pack animal. So back in February, I crossed 3 county borders to travel from my home county Wexford up to Dublin, just to get into the office, just to meet up with people, just to try to get to know the team a little bit more. So it's been tough, right? But no different for anybody else. You just have to change the way that you do things.
Absolutely. And I hear on the grapevine that the US are finally going to start letting us in from November. So fingers crossed, because I also have a team that I'm a part of that I have never met yet either. And I'm there over a year as well at that point. So I'm like you, very much looking forward to getting back to in person.
Yeah, and it's interesting, Siobhan, right? So when you think back to a non-COVID world, some of the people that you would have met, colleagues you would have met, clients perhaps maybe, and partners, you would have been invited into a meeting room, you would have formally shaken hands, and it would have been very formal. However, now you're in their house, right? You've perhaps maybe seen their children, you've perhaps maybe seen their partner bring them in a cup of tea, right? You've seen the inside of the house. And I think now, for me, meeting my team in person, as I have done over the last number of weeks, I don't feel that I don't know them. I feel that I actually know them really, really well. And putting that last piece of the jigsaw is actually getting that face in-person meeting.
Absolutely. And I feel like you've had to make more of an effort to get to know people as well and kind of dig a bit deeper. Look, we couldn't get away without talking about COVID and the pandemic and these unprecedented times, to use all the buzz and the cliche words that we've learned over the last 20 months. But do you think that progress has halted for diversity and inclusion in the workplace due to the pandemic?
Yeah, so I joined a panel session yesterday. I was privileged to join the Rise Up panel with Mark there only yesterday in Amsterdam. And I guess one of the headlines that we took away is that COVID really was an equalizer in some respects. We were all impacted, and I think the phrase that I heard in recent times was, we were all in the same storm, but perhaps maybe not in the same boat, right? So it impacted people differently. And as we look towards return to the office and what the future might look like, I think companies are still trying to understand what they need to do to support people to come back into the office. Some people have taken the opportunity maybe to rethink their priorities, right? To refocus on some of the things that are important to them and consider their options as well. So if you think about it, many don't want to do the 3-hour round trip commute into the office. They want to be there for their family. And perhaps maybe they've been equally as productive or as efficient or successful in the last 18 months. Let's be honest, the wheels on the bus didn't come off over the last 18 months or so in the payments and financial services sector, that's for sure. And I think diversity is so much more than just male and female ratios, right? Some people have perhaps maybe been struggling with mental health topics. Working from home is the phrase that we use, but actually, I think a lot of us have been living at work. Some of those underrepresented groups really do need to be supported. And the agenda really needs to be reinvigorated as well, because some of the challenges that we had around the DE&I agenda 18 months, 2 years ago have completely shifted. It really has.
Absolutely. And as you touched on there, as workplaces, that they're beginning to reevaluate what the office looks like, not just what return to work looks like. What are some important questions we should be asking ourselves now in order to prepare for that?
Yeah, I think the most important thing to do is to understand and be really clear about what's important for you. Okay, if you have kids, you might not want to travel as much. Maybe you've enjoyed being there at bath times, and now that the schools have gone back, maybe you've enjoyed that part, right? Perhaps maybe you can negotiate with your employer a couple of days a week. If you like the idea, perhaps maybe of being a digital nomad, right? Perhaps maybe you have no intention of going back to the office at all, and actually the role that you have doesn't matter, right? So I think when you look at what we should be asking ourselves, it is around what's important. And if perhaps maybe you're struggling with various different aspects around the impact that COVID has had, some people are finding it really difficult to separate the home and work. And if you have found that really difficult, perhaps maybe you need to be more visible. Perhaps maybe you need to start thinking about what your agenda will be at work. And I guess my guidance would be talk to your boss. Companies have policies, right? And maybe the policy is that everybody returns to the office. However, your circumstances are your own, and everybody is unique. So by having that open dialogue, talking through with your leaders in the organization, but really first and foremost, understand what it is you want to do. If you want to return to the office and you want to be back in 5 days a week, then that's great. But actually, some people now are looking to say, I was equally as successful at home. How do I get that right balance of still being visible so that I'm still a core part of the team, but still manage my home life a little bit better than what perhaps maybe I did 18 months, 2 years or so ago?
Yeah, completely. And I think, as you say, what we want is different for absolutely everybody, because it depends on your circumstances. As you said, some people can't wait to get back to the office and will be running there. Some people don't want to step foot inside there again, and other people would like a hybrid situation. So we know what we want, but now how do we help ourselves advocate to get that? For some, these might be quite difficult conversations to have. Any kind of tips or tools to help have these conversations with your manager or with a peer or with a team in order to kind of encourage that conversation to take place and to advocate for yourself?
Yeah, so first, as I said just a moment ago, it's about being really clear in terms of what you want. And it's not just about what you want for the end of the year, right? It's about what you want going forward, because companies are evaluating the workplace consistently across the globe, wherever you work at the moment and whichever industry you're working on. So I think my guidance would be is first be sure about what it is you want, and then arrange to have those conversations with your line manager or the organization. Companies have policies, and those policies are really super important for the organization. But how do they translate locally? Right. And I'm working with, perhaps maybe some colleagues, ex-colleagues in recent times. I believe that, some organizations have insisted that everybody comes back to the office 5 days a week. That's really tough. To go from nothing to 100% is really tough for people to manage and to adjust, right? We did it really well 18 months ago when everybody had to go from home, and people struggled then. But I think unless companies get it right coming back into the workforce, it can be equally or even more damaging to the workplace if they don't manage that properly. So be certain about what you want, have those conversations, and then follow it through, right? So never underestimate the value that you bring to the organization. And as long as you can articulate that with your line manager, or perhaps maybe with the organization generally, then hopefully something will work out. And if it doesn't, then perhaps maybe the culture of the organization has shifted, and perhaps maybe that doesn't align to where you want to be going forward.
Absolutely. No, thank you for that. Some great takeaways. So we're seeing schools return, services restart, travel coming back for us, conferences and events. Money 2020 is a great kind of flag to fly that for people as well, to see how it can be done in what is our new norm and our new world as the world resets. What would you say to people here today that are looking for that personal reboot or next opportunity? I know we've spoken about kind of evaluating how you want your future work to look like, but how do we evaluate kind of perhaps what is the next opportunity and perhaps where to go in the payments arena?
Yes, everyone used to say to me, you've got to have a vision, you've got to have a goal, right? What do you want to be when you grow up? Okay, and if I'm honest, I still don't know, right? I'm still kind of trying to find that in my mind. I'm still not grown up, right? So my challenge with planning so far ahead is that actually you might miss something along the way, right? So if you're looking for your next opportunity, think about what it might be and how it aligns to that full, maybe holistic long-term plan that you've got. There was a lot of talk yesterday, as Martha brought up, around the Great Resignation, right? There are so many jobs and so many opportunities across Ireland at the moment, but also within your own organisation. I'm sure there are promotion opportunities that perhaps maybe have been stalled because of COVID. And you need to try to work out what the plan is to get you back on the radar, to make sure that you can fulfill whatever aspirations you had within that organisation. I think in terms of culture, I headlined just a moment ago, culture is so super important. And for me, it's probably the single most important and deciding factor when choosing a role. So I choose to work for an organisation that is incredibly inclusive, incredibly diverse. Still lots of work to be done, but has an amazing group of leaders that have got the very same values that I aspire to as well. And I think having that common thread with either your leadership or your peers, and perhaps maybe some of the agendas that the company is driving, is so super important. And then refocus on what's important to you. Someone once told me many years ago when I had my first daughter that if you choose to work when you're a mum, you can only give 50%. You can only give 50% to your kids and 50% to work. And I spent probably 10 years when my kids were really small. That really ate me up inside. And then I realized my kids are now 20, 24, and at the age of 20, they're really well balanced. They're really happy. And you know what? And I talked yesterday about this. Perhaps maybe I wasn't there for 365 bath nights, right? But the bath nights that I was there, I made sure that they were super special. And they don't remember the ones that I wasn't there for. And I think sometimes we, as females, we beat ourselves up for some of the things that perhaps maybe don't actually matter as much as we think they do. We overthink things perhaps maybe a little bit at times. So I think in terms of rebooting, going back to your question, Siobhan, really focus on what's important to you and perhaps maybe stop giving yourself a hard time. You can actually have it all. You just need to work out which ones you want.
Absolutely, and stop carrying all that guilt around in a handy little backpack, because I know we're all guilty of that as well. Just a quick reminder to all our audience today, feel free to drop any questions you have or any comments or statements on the points mentioned so far into the chat. We'll have a bit of an open discussion at the end, so we'd love to hear from you. COVID accelerated changes in the payment landscape like we haven't seen before, especially in the e-commerce spectrum side of things. We won't talk about PSD2, but we can't not mention it. The stop start, is it going to happen? Is it not? We saw the payments landscape and e-commerce. We saw more businesses jump onto online payments than ever before. It was an unprecedented growth. How can we keep up as individuals and make sure that we stay current in the payments space? Sometimes it feels like, and it probably is, absolutely impossible to be abreast of all the current payment trends and topics. But do you have any kind of tips in this space that might be useful for everyone today?
Yeah, so use and leverage your network. I'd be fiercely proud and fiercely protective of the network that I've built up over the last number of years. I use that to find out what's happening, the word on the street. So press articles are great, right? But actually, what does it mean? I suggest, take time to check out the landscape. LinkedIn is a great forum for that. You'll often find perhaps maybe competitors or perhaps maybe clients and partners posting articles about the things that are important to them. So I use and leverage those an awful lot. But don't underestimate the power of those. The European Women Payment Network is super important, but there are so many communities across the payments landscape that I would check in with, keep relationships going with, just to find out what's happening, not necessarily right now, but what direction perhaps maybe our competitors or our partners are heading. If I think about the Money 2020 agenda for us over the course of this last week, I have my teams. Who are our partners working with? What are they focused on? Trying to bring that back and then bringing the team together to share those ideas and perspectives. So super important to spend time with your teams, your peer groups, but also your network and competitors, right? It's a small incestuous world that we work in. The payments industry is so incredibly incestuous. So use and leverage your network as much as possible.
So with that in mind, are there any key trends in the payments arena that you're experiencing or expecting to see in the road ahead without looking too far into the future?
Yeah, the landscape changes day to day, right? Every day you read a new press article that perhaps maybe there's another alliance or perhaps maybe another acquisition. The industry continues to merge and consolidate, which is super exciting, really, really exciting. I suppose one of the headlines for me, we've been using these words, frictionless payments, unified commerce over the last number of years. I think now what I'm seeing is that those joining of the dots is really starting to happen, whereas before it was very much a concept, whereas now joining the dots together, I think for me, this is part of the reason why I personally made the change from a core acquirer to a more of a holistic banking service provider, is because merchant acquiring on its own is probably not quite enough for our clients at this point in time. They're looking for the innovation, what's happening next. Payment orchestration layers are really key, and pulling together not just the pay-in component, right? So taking the payments at the front end, it's often around managing those payments, the payouts as well. So it's the full liquidity suite of solutions as well. And for us, I guess, just, headlining, we've always been an e-commerce acquirer here at JP Morgan in Europe. We process a huge amount of transactions for some of the world's biggest brands here in region, but we've started to change the way that we're working, and over the course of the next few weeks you'll see a little bit more around our move into the omni-channel space. So it's a journey. We're moving in with various different partners, and that's because of this frictionless experience that we're so committed to driving. So I think that's consistent across the industry. If we make it easy for people to spend, then they absolutely will. And I speak from experience. I think my postman on post have been delivering most days. My dogs get incredibly excited when the delivery comes, right? But if they make it easier, then I do tend to spend more.
Absolutely. No, thank you for that. And there's some great tips and takeaway nuggets for us. As we kind of come to a conclusion, I'd love some tips from you about how we keep pushing ourselves out of our comfort zone, and how we keep, not necessarily, it's not always about career progression or growth. Many people here today will be very happy and solid in their current role, and that's not what it's about. But how do we make sure that we're learning and we're pushing ourselves out of our comfort zone and taking those little leaps of faith, or those steps into the unknown?
Yeah, so sometimes you can push yourself a little bit too far, right? And actually, it's really important that you don't become complacent. It absolutely is, but you just need to be careful sometimes in terms of how far you do push. I'm a great believer, and a lot of my leadership style would be strengths-based leadership, right? So rather than beating myself up on perhaps maybe some of the areas that I'm not quite so strong at, I've chosen, my career path has been very much centered around, these are my strengths. So rather than trying to fill the gaps, I've tried to flourish even more and grow even more in that particular space. So I think focus more on your strengths, right? Still keep pushing yourself, but you don't have to be out of your comfort zone to learn more.
That's great. It's a term we hear so much, step out of your comfort zone. So that's a great perspective to look at. And I take that on board completely. And I think everyone should focus on their strengths. We're not all going to be good at everything, but we can be really good at what we are good at.
Exactly.
So as we kind of wrap up, I'd love to have one call to action from you today for all our listeners with us, about something that they can take with them and take away from this, and set themselves a challenge that they're going to do something in the next week, month, the next quarter.
Yeah, so throughout my career, there's been several influences that have helped either shape or guide my trajectory. And I valued all the comments, the support that I've had, but I really struggled to perhaps maybe put them and compartmentalize and put them into different categories. So people always talk around, mentorship's really important, but I do wonder sometimes, the people that I meet, whether they really understand what a mentor actually is. And because perhaps maybe they're looking for someone to coach them, or perhaps maybe they're looking for their next career move, so they're actually looking for a sponsor. And then sometimes, and I'm guilty of this myself, I had someone that was a mentor to me, but they were probably more of a role model than a mentor, right? So I think my guidance to the audience would be, identify who your role model is. And a role model is somebody that you either aspire to be or perhaps maybe look up to. In my home office, I have two images on the top of my PC screens. I have a picture of Grace Hopper. If you don't know who she is, then look her up. She was an absolute rock star, a trailblazer in the technology world. She's the reason why we have a laptop at home or at work. And then the other person is Jurgen Klopp. I'm a little bit of a Liverpool fan, but in terms of the way that he leads his team, I really aspire to be the leader that he is. And for me, having those role models, it reminds me of what I need to do. The second part is listen to your coach. So find out and really identify who your coaches are at work. So it can be your boss, it can be perhaps maybe somebody within the organization. This is somebody, and if you think about it in terms of maybe the GAA at home here, it's somebody that shouts from the sidelines, you need to be doing this, you need to run fast, you need to think more strategically. It's somebody that stands on the sidelines and tells you what you need to be doing to be better. The next part is a mentor, right? So this is the person that listens to you and guides you, but they're your ideas. So a mentor should be able to lift out the magic within you. And then the last person is know who your sponsors are, right? So within your organization, you'll have people, perhaps maybe it's not an official relationship, but you'll have people that talk about you when you're not there. You'll have people that will elevate you. So identify those 4 key influences in your career. And once you do, you'll find that things like promotion, things like development, things like perhaps maybe filling in some of those gaps that you have, or even elevating you in terms of driving those strengths even further will be a lot easier. But find out who they are, make a mental note of them and work them consistently.
I think they're fantastic, because I think it's so important to have each of those people in your, not just your career life, but your life holistically as well. One thing I would say is, do you ever get, sometimes people can be worried about approaching and asking someone to be their mentor. Personally, I think that it's a really great compliment that you could ask someone. What are your thoughts on that? Because I'm sure you get asked a lot.
I do internally and externally, and I take my role as a mentor really seriously, but also I find the relationships I have with mentees to be a mentor relationship as well, right? So going back to, I suppose, my learning agenda, it's so important that I'm connected to people that are working in perhaps maybe different organizations or in different roles across the business, so that I can make sure that I'm still incredibly relevant. So my thoughts around that, just make sure you know what it is you want to get out of that mentoring relationship. So I would have had over the last number of years many conversations, and people have said, you know, I'm really excited to be working with you as my mentor, but they don't necessarily know what they want to get out of it, right? So just be really certain about the objectives and what you want to get out of that mentoring relationship, because if you don't know, it is unlikely that mentor will be able to guide you, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And also make the best use of the time you're given with that person as well. So there's lots happening in the chat, so I'm going to have a quick peek in here now. And Blonid, do you want to jump on? And I know you've been filtering the questions.
I will. Thanks to you both. Super advice from two very influencing women and inspiring women in our industry. And it's great to hear from you and to hear the tips that you're about today, Sarah, especially around people's careers and the influencers there that we can actually start working on today as well. So that's great. Thank you very much. There's a lot of activity on the chat, so I'll come straight to maybe one of the first questions. And you raised the idea of networking and the importance of network and networks like our own one here, the EWPN. Does the value of that type of networking increase as you get more senior, or is it just as useful and accessible and valuable for somebody who's starting out at an early stage in their career? Does that change at all as you progress throughout your career?
Yeah, I think it does. So when I started in paint, these kind of forums and communities didn't exist, right? And it was really tough. And I think for me, there was a frustration because every female, either leader or perhaps maybe peer and colleague in the industry that I met with, I learned more. So for me, having these communities, making sure that you use and leverage them, irrespective of where you are in your career. I've encouraged my own daughters who are just literally, one's at university, the other one has just finished university after 4 years of study. And my first guidance to her would be, make sure you join the network. Find the people that perhaps maybe have the same views or values or aspirations as you do, because bouncing off and learning from each other is how we all grow. Super important. Okay,
thank you. Another very interesting question here. I suppose, what's the one thing you may say to yourself as you were starting out in your career that, you know, you'd wish you'd known back then, if you could go back in time and talk to yourself as you were starting out? What piece of advice would you have imparted to yourself back then?
I'm going to go with two, if you don't mind.
Okay.
First one would be is just don't sweat the small stuff, right? So I spent way too long worrying about things that perhaps maybe didn't really matter. And it took me a little while to kind of put those into a box. Still something that I think about, but you keep them in the box, right? Because otherwise it perhaps maybe prevents you from learning and growing. And the other piece would be, right, know and really understand the value that you bring. Okay, so again, it took me a little while to perhaps maybe really understand the value that I bring to perhaps maybe the organizations that I've worked for. But once you're clear on that, then you have, and irrespective again of what level or grade you are within the organization, everybody brings value. Just make sure you know what that is and really leverage it, but make sure that everybody else that you're working with understands it as well, right? There's no point in keeping that magic inside. You need to make sure that you share it too.
Okay. There's another interesting question here. It's related to levels of stress and good stress and bad stress. And just one comment here about stress potentially increasing as roles get more senior, and does it become a real problem, and how you cope with stress? Yeah,
so I have a Fitbit here, and often my heart rate goes up during the day, and I can see, I think managing stress is very much a personal thing, right? So what I try to do, as I say, is to compartmentalize the things that perhaps maybe I can deal with later, or perhaps maybe the things that aren't as important to the day-to-day work that I do. In terms of managing it, I probably eat a little bit too much chocolate, right? And I perhaps maybe don't get enough exercise. But I do find that switching off, my post box is about 150 meters from my front door. And without doubt, I will go down when the postman comes. I will go down irrespective of the weather, just go down, deep breaths. I think one of the key things I learned many years ago was around you can't change perhaps maybe the way that people behave, things that are out of your control. Perhaps maybe you're working with people and sometimes they're quite difficult, and that increases the stress levels. You can't change them, but what you can do is change the way that you manage it, change the way that you manage those expectations, right? So managing that is probably the key to managing success, to managing stress, because you're able to perhaps maybe take a step back. And sometimes in a personal situation, you don't know the stress or the issues that other person has going on at this moment in time, right? So sometimes perhaps maybe taking a step back, taking a deep breath, perhaps maybe putting yourself in their shoes gives you the ability to manage that stress a little bit differently.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks, Sarah. Another general question around mentorship, and I know you touched on it briefly earlier with Siobhan. A comment that some people tend to shy away from becoming a mentor, and how do you know you're at a stage in your career or that you're ready to actually become a mentor?
Yeah, I think sometimes, and maybe this is a little conflicting, right? But sometimes we put mentors up on a pedestal. Okay, so I have mentors of various different positions and roles throughout the industry. I don't know whether or not some of these relationships I have, I don't know if some of these people know that they're my mentors, okay, because I don't put a badge on it. But what I do is I proactively want to spend time with these people to talk through things, right, to validate. And they might be people within my own organization, and they're often people outside of the organization as well. And I think sometimes we can put a label or a badge on mentorship. I'm sure every single person on this call here today has some sort of mentoring relationship, whether it's formalized or whether it's just as a sounding board for a friend, right? It comes in so many different shapes or sizes. And I think this goes back to the networking topic. If you've got people in your life that are influencing the way that you work, influencing the way that you think, or perhaps maybe influencing your career, they are already a mentor, or they are a coach, or they are perhaps maybe a sponsor. We just have to be a little bit careful with the badges that we put on people.
Okay. There's two other very interesting questions, and one is actually directly to yourself about the, you know, maybe the value that you bring to a company, Sarah, and you know, for all of us listening to you speak, it's very inspiring what you do, and you know, could you articulate for us the key strengths and the value that you've brought to the companies that you've worked for? And it ties into another question that somebody's asked about, you know, what advice you could give to understand the value that you bring, you know. So maybe by highlighting the value that you feel you bring, we can get an idea of how we might look to identify that for ourselves as well.
Yeah, so there's two types of value, I guess, that I think that I bring to an organization. One would be, because I'm a sales girl by heart, right, is the revenue, right? So the impact in terms of the revenue, the P&L, top and bottom line. That's one aspect. And that's something, I guess, for me throughout my career as a salesperson, you're judged, measured, managed, rewarded and reprimanded on the basis of a number at the end of every single year. There's only one thing I could be certain of, was when January the 1st came, the number went back to 0 and I had to do it all again, right? So in terms of that monetary fiscal value, then absolutely. But I'd like to think also across the organizations that I've worked within to drive change. So Grace Hopper is quoted, and for any of you that have looked at my LinkedIn profile, there's a banner that sits behind my image, and it's a Grace Hopper quote to say that the most dangerous word, most dangerous phrase in the English language is, it's always been done that way. So I guess for me, I've always specialized, and I absolutely love transformation. So whether that's sales transformation, organizational transformation, or business transformation, that's something that I really, really enjoy. And it's taken a long time for me to go through my career to get to a point where I can actually affect the change that I want to drive within the organization. I have the ability to do that here within JP Morgan, but I'm a long time in the payments industry, right? So when I look at that compared to perhaps maybe the cultural aspects, right? So I want to be a culture carrier. I believe I'm a culture carrier here. I'm blessed to work with a number of like-minded individuals within the organization. And it's so important to find that synergy across the cultural elements of any organization. So in terms of the value, I'm hoping on the money side, that's always had an impact, but also in terms of driving that change that's needed for an organization to be successful.